In this second video of my three-part series, I want to critique the analysis by Mr. Salza concerning the issue of attending an SSPX Mass, especially fulfilling your Sunday obligation there, according to the Pontifical Commission Ecclesia Dei, the PCED. This is largely in reference to the video The SSPX and Sunday Obligation at the Logos Project, which I will link to in the description, as well as all the other resources I used in order to make this video. Mr. Salza claims that according to the PCED, you cannot fulfill your Sunday obligation at the SSPX. The critique I will offer is threefold. First, when dealing with documents which speak about Sunday obligation explicitly, Mr. Salza is either leaving out relevant context or he is providing additional context without any sources to prove these additional assertions. Secondly, in the video I am addressing, he leaves out a most relevant document which concerns SSPX Mass attendance directly and Sunday obligation indirectly. This document is very important if you want to analyze the view of the SSPX by the PCED, but Mr. Salza does not address it in his video and is therefore cherry-picking himself, which shows that he is guilty of the same thing he accuses the SSPX of. Thirdly and finally, when he does engage in an article on his website with said document of the PCED, which he left out in the video, he is building a case against the possibility to fulfill your Sunday obligation, which is, in my opinion, most absurd and has to in fact presuppose stupidity, ignorance, or malevolence on the part of the author of this document, the then Secretary of the PCED, Monsignor Hoyos. So before I get into it, let me clarify one thing. Mr. Salza wants us to believe that the PCED has the same view on the issue of fulfilling one's Sunday obligation at an SSPX chapel as he does, namely that the PCED has actually been clear in asserting that you cannot fulfill your Sunday obligation there, and the SSPX is just cherry-picking one statement from 2002 in order to prove the contrary. My main goal in this video is to demonstrate that, firstly, the PCED has not been as clear and consistent with their statements, and secondly, that when reading all of their relevant statements from the beginning until the end, it is in actual fact more reasonable to conclude the opposite, namely that you can fulfill your Sunday obligation at an SSPX chapel. And this is a criticism I already made in my previous video, and something that I really think Mr. Salza is guilty of, representing something as super clear when there is actually a serious debate to be had. Now let's begin. In this video, I am mainly addressing the video, as I've said, which is titled The SSPX and Sunday Obligation, where Mr. Salza goes through many statements by the Church or the PCED which deal with mass attendance and the question of fulfilling one's Sunday obligation at an SSPX chapel. I will link to this video in the description so you can watch it for yourself. In the video, he says that these are all the statements by the Church or the PCED he could find, but as we will see, he actually left out one, which is maybe even the most important and the most comprehensive one. But first, I will go through the two statements from the PCED that exist, which deal with the topic of fulfilling your Sunday obligation at SSPX Chapel explicitly and directly. Here I want to mention as a short side note that I am not including the statement by the Church from 2012, where when they were asked if you can fulfill your Sunday obligation at an SSPX chapel, the answer was simply a repetition of the current status of the SSPX without giving a clear yes or no. Mr. Salza mainly uses one statement with which he wants to definitely prove his point, namely that one cannot fulfill one's Sunday obligation according to the PCED. This is a statement from Monsignor Pearl, which was provided in an article by Father de Montieu in a French magazine named Tu es Petros, which is the journal of the FSSP, in 2002. There, the author was establishing the extreme position of saying that the SSPX is not Catholic at all, and is even more removed from the Catholic Church than the Orthodox. And I could not find the original edition that published this article. I only found an old article from another website, which quotes this article and critically engages with it. If anyone could provide me with the original article of the French magazine, I would greatly appreciate it. I will now read from the text by Chris Ferrara from 2002, which quoted the article in the magazine Tu es Petrus. Quote, Father de Montheuil's article includes an annex consisting of answers to questions relative to his article by none other than Monsignor Pearl in his capacity as Secretary of the Ecclesia Dei Commission. The answers were given on April 15, 2002. For some reason, Monsignor Pearl's correspondence, at least as reproduced in the article, lacks the protocol number that one would expect to see in an official determination of the Commission. 2 of the questions and answers are quoted here. Question: if for a serious reason one has to assist at a Mass of the Fraternité Saint-Piedis, marriage, funeral, school feast, should one abstain from communion? Answer: yes, for Eucharistic communion is also a communion with the Catholic Church. The Church makes the Eucharist and the Eucharist makes the Church, from which these priests have separated themselves. Question: has one sinned if one deviated from the discipline of the Church concerning the Sunday obligation and the manner of fulfilling it? Answer: yes. The obligation is clearly enunciated and explained by the Catechism of the Catholic Church at 2180 to 2183. In other words, it is a sin to receive Holy Communion at any SSPX chapel, or even passively to assist at SSPX Masses without a grave reason. And one also sins by attending an SSPX Mass to fulfill the Sunday obligation. These answers are consistent with Father de Montheuil's novel claim that all the SSPX priests and bishops are non-Catholic ministers. End quote. What I believe is important to mention here is that these statements were brought up in an article of a magazine of the FSSP. And since I couldn't find the original, I cannot verify the claim by Mr. Salza where he says that this statement was meant for the whole church, that is, that it had a universal capacity. But just from the face of it, it doesn't really seem that way, actually. At least it would be a strange choice to address the whole church through a citation within an article from a French print magazine. Maybe there is actually an official document where this can be found too, outside of this article. So if anyone could provide me with the primary source, I would, again, greatly appreciate it. Because Mr. Salza claims that this was a communiqué for the whole church. But so far, I couldn't verify this claim, and it seems to me that this might not be the case. Add to this the fact that apparently the protocol number was also lacking. All these contextual facts are not mentioned by Mr. Salza, and this is my first criticism. He's not providing, in my opinion, relevant context. So this is actually the only document which would really support Mr. Salza's view unequivocally. So let's move on to the other document, which seems to contradict the statements made by Monsignor Pearl, which were provided in this article from Tu es Petrus. In this next document, Monsignor Pearl says, in an answer to a faithful asking the question, that, quote, in a strict sense, you can fulfill your Sunday obligation at an SSPX chapel, end quote. Mr. Salza, however, is saying that this statement by Monsignor Pearl was taken out of context from a private letter and has been corrected shortly after, having been leaked, and that in this specific circumstance, the faithful asking the question had, according to Salza, quote, no recourse to any Catholic Church available, end quote. Mr. Salza, however, doesn't provide a source for this specific assertion. When we'll now read the full letter of clarification from the beginning to the end, which was issued by Monsignor Pearl, we will see that he actually does not mention any further details about the specific circumstances this faithful was in. At least, I couldn't find any evidence or source that supports Mr. Salza's claim that there was, quote, no recourse to any Catholic Church available. The only thing we learn from the clarification letter is the general statement that this person's circumstances were, quote, specific. I would like to know where Mr. Salza obtained the knowledge about this person's specific circumstances. Rather, in this letter of clarification issued by Monsignor Pearl, he actually reiterates the point that in a strict sense you can fulfill your Sunday obligation at the SSPX, without giving any further details regarding the circumstances that faithful was in. One would think that a letter of clarification would be the perfect way to describe these specific details. I will now read the full letter of clarification from Monsignor Pearl from January 2003. Quote, "Greetings in the hearts of Jesus and Mary. There have been several inquiries about our letter of September 27th, 2002. In order to clarify things, Monsignor Pearl has made the following response." Monsignor Pearl's response: "Unfortunately, as you will understand, we have no way of controlling what is done with our letters by the recipients. Our letter of September 27, 2002, which was evidently cited in the remnant and on various websites, was intended as a private communication dealing with the specific circumstances of the person who wrote us. What was presented in the public forum is an abbreviated version of that letter which omits much of our pastoral counsel. Since a truncated form of this letter has now become public, we judge it appropriate to present the larger context of our response. In a previous letter to the same correspondent, we had already indicated the canonical status of the Society of St. Pius X, which we will summarize briefly here. First, priests of the SSPX are validly ordained, but they are suspended from exercising their priestly functions. To the extent that they adhere to the schism of the late Archbishop Lefebvre, they are also excommunicated. Second, concretely this means that the masses offered by these priests are valid but illicit, i.e. contrary to the law of the Church. Points 1 and 3 in our letter of September 27th to this correspondent are accurately reported. His first question was, quote, "Can I fulfill my Sunday obligation by attending a Pius X Mass?" And our response was, quote, "In a strict sense, you may fulfill your Sunday obligation by attending a Mass celebrated by a priest of the Society of St. Pius X. His second question was, "Is it a sin for me to attend a Pius X Mass?" And we responded stating, "We have already told you that we cannot recommend your attendance at such a Mass and have explained the reason why. If your primary reason for attending were to manifest your desire to separate yourself from communion with the Roman Pontiff and those in communion with him, it would be a sin. If your intention is simply to participate in a Mass according to the 1962 Missal for the sake of devotion, this would not be a sin." His third question was, "Is it a sin for me to contribute to the Sunday collection of a Pius X Mass?" To which we responded, "It would seem that a modest contribution to the collection at Mass could be justified." Further, the correspondent took the Commission to task for not doing its job properly, and we responded thus: "This Pontifical Commission does not have the authority to coerce bishops to provide for the celebration of the Mass according to the 1962 Roman Missal. Nonetheless, we are frequently in contact with bishops and do all that we can to see that this provision is made. However, this provision also depends on the number of people who desire the traditional Mass, their motives, and the availability of priests who can celebrate it. You also state in your letter that the Holy Father has given you a right to the Mass according to the 1962 Roman Missal. This is not correct. It is true that he has asked his brother bishops to be generous in providing for the celebration of this Mass, but he has not stated that it is a right. Presently, it constitutes an exception to the Church's law and may be granted when the local bishop judges it to be a valid pastoral service and when he has the priests who are available to celebrate it. Every Catholic has a right to the sacraments, but he does not have a right to them according to the right of his choice. We hope that this puts in clearer light the letter about which you asked us. With prayerful best wishes for this new year of our Lord 2003, I remain sincerely yours in Christ." End quote. I would like to see how Mr. Salza's argument can continue to work here, because if Mr. Salza is correct with his claim that there were no other churches available for this faithful, why isn't Monsignor Pearl putting this fact in his letter of clarification? He rather simply restates that you can fulfill your Sunday obligation in a strict sense. It is interesting that when you read this whole letter of clarification, which Mr. Salza is trying to use to debunk the claim that one can fulfill one's Sunday obligation at the SSPX, it actually tends to disprove his point, because again, Monsignor Pearl states the exact same thing in his letter of clarification, namely that in the strict sense, you can fulfill your Sunday obligation. It goes even further because he doesn't only reiterate it, but he also adds that this point was, quote, accurately reported. It is really strange to me why one wants to use this document to disprove the argument that you can fulfill your Sunday obligation, when actually pretty much the opposite is stated. Mr. Salza makes further arguments and elaborated what in the strict sense means, or what Monsignor Pearl meant by it, and how it supports his assertions. But again, those are his own additional arguments, and they are not made by Monsignor Pearl himself, which would beg the question of why Monsignor Pearl did not make all these arguments that Mr. Salza makes himself. I have also heard Mr. Salza say that Monsignor Pearl could have given the same answer if he was asked, for example, if one could fulfill his Sunday obligation by praying the rosary, and the answer would be, in the strict sense, you can fulfill your Sunday obligation by praying the rosary. While this statement may very well be true in principle, Mr. Salza is still reading it into the letter, because it doesn't make sense why Monsignor Pearl would not have added such a fact to this letter of clarification, which would have been the perfect place for that. It doesn't make much sense, if Monsignor Pearl would be of the same opinion as Salza, for him to not put in such a caveat, in order to not mislead the faithful. Something like, in the strict sense, you can fulfill your Sunday obligation at an SSPX chapel, just like you could by praying the rosary. The fact that he didn't add such a statement points to the fact that he didn't see it like that. And Mr. Salza is just, in a way, projecting his own view onto his statements. I think it is reasonable for a Catholic, when he hears this statement by Monsignor Pearl, which puts Sunday obligation in the strict sense next to Mass attendance, to assume that your Sunday obligation is fulfilled not only by sanctifying the Lord's Day through prayer at the Mass, or other extraordinary means, like praying the rosary, but through the classical mean of attending a Mass. Mass attendance and Sunday obligation are deeply connected, whereas praying the rosary is not really as connected to Sunday obligation. So it would be indeed misleading by Monsignor Pearl, if he thought like Mr. Salza, to leave it at that and just expect Catholics to understand that his statement here is not connecting the fact that you attend Mass at an SSPX chapel with fulfilling the Sunday obligation, but only the fact that if you pray there and thus sanctify the Lord's Day, you would fulfill your Sunday obligation. So in that sense, it would not be the Mass attendance in itself, strictly speaking, that would fulfill your Sunday obligation, even though it is asked if you can fulfill your Sunday obligation by Mass attendance. All these leaps can really not be expected to be made by any Catholic. And the fact that Monsignor Pearl did not elaborate on this in the letter of clarification almost certainly proves that he did not see it that way, like Mr. Salza does. Whereas, if you interpret his letter naturally, you don't have to do any of these weird leaps. And also, why did Monsignor Pearl not simply state the exact same thing he said in the magazine 2S Petrus? In Mr. Salza's view, who claims that there is clarity and consistency on the part of the PCED, these facts are really not reconcilable. If Monsignor Pearl was of the same opinion as Mr. Salza on this issue, it wouldn't make much sense that Pearl would not just state, at least additionally, that you would normally sin if you wanted to fulfill your Sunday obligation at the SSPX. If we followed Mr. Salza's line of thinking, we would really have to assume that Monsignor Pearl is dishonest in some way, or deliberately withholding very important information from us and from this faithful, which is, let's be honest, an absurd assumption to make, because we have to remember that in this letter of clarification, Monsignor Pearl does provide additional counsel, and even then, he does not talk in any way like he seemingly did in the article from 2S Petrus. So I think we can already see that even if we just look at all the documents or statements that exist which are addressing the issue of fulfilling one's Sunday obligation specifically and explicitly by the PCED, Mr. Salza's argument that the Church has been consistent and clear on this issue, in a negative sense, already falls apart. Also, if we look at these two statements in their entirety, there are, as I've shown, a lot more facts to be taken into account in order to analyze them responsibly and thoroughly. Again, we obviously have to recheck and verify many of the claims and statements that Mr. Salza is making. But now, I want to go further and also include the other document which Mr. Salza conveniently left out in his video, which talks about the SSPX and Mass attendance in general, but as we will see, is also crucial when dealing with the question of fulfilling one's Sunday obligation. It is a letter from 2008 where a certain Mr. Brian Mershon inquired the PCED concerning the SSPX and then published a response, together with some commentary. I will now read the whole thing, including the introduction by Mr. Mershon and his commentary, which will become relevant later on. Some of it will be, as we see, outdated, since this was from 2008. Quote, Monsignor Camille Perle, Vice President of the Pontifical Commission Ecclesia Dei, has recently responded with a letter dated May 23, 2008, to questions I invoked regarding the official canonical status of the Society of St. Pius X and those Catholics who attend their chapels to fulfill their Sunday obligation. This article is certain to generate much commentary, both from diehard SSPXers who can't bear to believe their marriages and confessions might be invalid, to more Catholic than the Pope conservatives who will continue to misconstrue the clear teaching of the PCED, Cardinal Castrillon, and the Catholic Church regarding laity who attend SSPX Chapel to fulfill their Sunday obligation. Indeed, the repeated public statements of Cardinal Castrillon that the SSPX is not informal schism certainly rises above the level of a cleric's private opinion on matters outside of his competence. His statements can be viewed by all Catholics as reflected of the current position of the Catholic Church on these matters. While some canonists in good faith might disagree, Cardinal Castrillon and the PCED's responses to private correspondence certainly rise above the level of authority of a mere canonist's opinion. The responses of the letter can be acted upon with a moral certitude. His Eminence, Dario Cardinal Castrillon Hoyos, President Pontifical Commission Ecclesia Dei, Monday of Holy Week, Anno Domini 2008. Your Eminence, I have compiled as reference numerous public interviews, both print and television, where you were quoted as stating that the case of the Society of St. Pius X is not a formal schism, and other words to that effect. Question: is this your mere private opinion, or the official teaching of the Catholic Church in your official capacity as head of the Pontifical Commission Ecclesia Dei? PCED response: statements made by Cardinal Castrillon need to be understood in a technical canonical sense. Stating that the Society of St. Pius X is not in formal schism is to say that there has been no official declaration on the part of the Holy See that the Society of St. Pius X is in schism. Up to now, the Church has sought to show the maximum charity, courtesy, and consideration to all those involved with the hope that such a declaration will not eventually be necessary. Question: would you please clarify the following for me in this private correspondence so that I can ensure that my family and I are following the current teaching of the Church on this specific matter? Question: does the Catholic Church currently hold that the priests and bishops of the Society of St. Pius X are in formal schism with the Catholic Church? PCED response: the bishops of the Society of St. Pius X are excommunicated according to the prescription of Canon 1382 of the Code of Canon Law, which states that a bishop who consecrates someone a bishop without pontifical mandate, and the person who receives the consecration from him, incur a latae sententiae excommunication reserved to the Apostolic See. Archbishop Lefebvre was duly reminded of this before his conferral of episcopal ordination on 30th June 1988, and the Holy Father confirmed that this penalty had been incurred in his apostolic letter Ecclesia Dei. The priests of the Society of St. Pius X are validly ordained but suspended, that is, prohibited from exercising their priestly functions because they are not properly coordinated in the Diocese of Religious Institute in full communion with the Holy See. and also because those ordained after the schismatic episcopal ordinations were ordained by an excommunicated bishop. Concretely, this means that the masses offered by priests of Society of St. Pius X are valid but illicit, i.e. contrary to canon law. While it is true that participation in the Mass at chapels of the SSPX does not in and of itself constitute a formal adherence to the schism, such adherence can come about over a period of time as one slowly imbibes a schismatic mentality, which separates itself from the teaching of the Supreme Pontiff and the entire Catholic Church. While we hope and pray for reconciliation with the SSPX, the Pontifical Commission Ecclesia Dei cannot recommend that members of the faithful frequent their chapels for the reasons which we have outlined above. We deeply regret this situation and pray that soon a reconciliation of the SSPX with the Church may come about, but until such time the explanations which we have given remain in force. Question: does the Catholic Church currently hold that the situation of the SSPX is not one for ecumenical dialogue because the SSPX is an internal matter within the Catholic Church? PCED answer: up to now, the Catholic Church has acted as if the situation of the Society of St. Pius X is an internal matter within the Catholic Church, not a matter of ecumenical dialogue. Question: do lay Catholics who frequent the SSPX chapels, either more or less frequently, incur any sin or canonical delict by doing so, if done solely out of devotion to the Church's Latin liturgical tradition, and not to separate oneself from communion with one's diocesan ordinary or local pastor? PCD response: Catholics who frequent the chapels of the Society of St. Pius X do not incur any sin or canonical delict by doing so. However, we further refer you to what we have already stated in answer number 4 above. Question: what level of authority do your answers to this private correspondence hold? PCD answer: as we already stated to you in our letter of July 4, 2007, this Pontifical Commission does its best to transmit responses which are in full accord with the magisterium and the present canonical practices of the Catholic Church. One should accept them with docility and can act upon them with moral certainty. We would further add that no dicastery of the Holy See will give other responses than those which we have given here. Commentary on the PCD responses by Brian C. Mershon. First, the current language being used by the Catholic Church avoids saying that the Society of St. Pius X is in formal schism. Second, Archbishop Lefebvre and the other 4 bishops he ordained in the SSPX directly against the express will of the Holy Father incurred excommunication, as outlined by the Code of Canon Law and confirmed by the Congregation of 4 bishops and Pope John Paul II in his motu proprio Ecclesia Dei Afflicta. Third, the Society of St. Pius X priests are suspended from priestly ministry. Therefore, objectively speaking, they are committing sins of grave matter by continuing their active ministry without a specific mandate of the Church. Of course, the Society's official claim, wrongly or rightly, is that the salvation of souls and the current state of emergency in the Church forces them to continue to offer their ministries without ecclesiastical approval. There has been no indication by the Catholic Church that the priests as a whole are excommunicated or in formal schism. Fourth, therefore, all the sacraments offered by the Society of St. Pius X priests, with the exception of penance and matrimony, are valid but illicit, meaning illegal. Fifth, Catholic laymen may attend Mass at the Society of St. Pius X Chapel without committing any sin nor incurring any canonical penalty. However, the PCED guidance is that it cannot recommend attendance at the SSPX chapels due to the danger of imbibing a schismatic mentality. In other words, someone might find some society priests fomenting division from full communion with the Church, the local ordinary, and or the Holy Father in their sermons. The PCD's recommendation is not to attend their chapels habitually, but they acknowledge there is no sin committed nor canonical penalty incurred resulting from attending Mass at the SSPX chapels solely out of the desire to worship according to the 1962 Missal and in order to fulfill their Sunday obligation. Sixth, the Society of St. Pius X is in an irregular canonical situation and an internal matter, and therefore is not a case of ecumenical dialogue. Again, the correspondence from the PCED can be accepted and acted upon with docility and moral certitude by Catholics. The specific questions I asked were broad enough in nature to constitute an official response for Catholics to use as guidance. Catholic priests, bishop, or laymen who contradict these specific responses seem to be out of step with the Church's current official position. End quote. So here we really have a rather comprehensive and also authoritative statement by the Church regarding multiple issues on the SSPX. There are surely many things to be said about this whole text, but in this video I just want to engage with what is said about Mass attendance and how it relates to the Sunday obligation. In the video, where Mr. Salza wants to claim that the Church has been clear and consistent when it comes to fulfilling one's Sunday obligation at the SSPX, he doesn't mention this document, but unnecessarily so, because in an article of his on his website, True or False Pope, he actually engages with this document and tries to debunk the claim that it can be used as evidence for the fact that one can fulfill one's Sunday obligation at the SSPX. So I will go into his main argument, which he uses in the article, and on which his case hinges upon. He says that Mr. Mershon never explicitly asked the question about Sunday obligation, but only if it is okay to frequent the chapels of the SSPX. So there is a distinction between Mass attendance and fulfilling Sunday obligation. And this distinction is indeed real, because attending a Mass doesn't necessarily mean that you also fulfill your obligation at the same time. So Mr. Salza is right in principle that there can be a distinction between attendance and fulfillment. And to further substantiate this, he uses an official answer that states that it would not be sinful to attend a Mass at an independent chapel, but at the same time, it wouldn't satisfy one's Sunday obligation, and it would be a sin to do so. This is obviously true, because attendance itself may not be the problem, and under given circumstances, a Catholic can even attend a Protestant service. But he shouldn't participate or assist in any way, and this obviously would also not fulfill his Sunday obligation. So as I said, the distinction between attendance and fulfillment is a true distinction, but Mr. Salza is separating them to the point where the question asked by Mr. Mershon about attendance loses its meaning and is completely devoid from its purpose here, namely to figure out if we can fulfill our Sunday obligation at the SSPX. This purpose becomes clear when we read the whole letter, because Mr. Mershon mentions Sunday obligation at the beginning in his introductory and at the end in his commentary. So it is clear that his intention was to find out if he could fulfill his Sunday obligation by attending or frequenting SSPX Masses. Now, what Mr. Salza would say is that since in the questions and answers Sunday obligation wasn't mentioned explicitly in any way, but it was only talked about attendance or frequent, we cannot validly derive from Monsignor Pearl's answers anything about the question of fulfilling Sunday obligation at an SSPX chapel. There's multiple ways to deconstruct this argument. Let's first focus on what is fundamental and most important about the question by Mr. Mershon about Mass attendance, namely, if it is a sin or not to frequent SSPX chapels. The most important thing we as Catholics want to know is if there is any sin involved. Mr. Mershon is obviously aware of this utmost importance, and I'm sure that the PCED and Cardinal Hoyos is also aware that this is the most fundamental issue for any specific faithful. Is it a sin or not? So if in Cardinal Hoyos' mind it could be a sin to attend an SSPX Mass, he would surely mention it. And in fact, he does mention it. He says that if one would attend an SSPX Mass with a schismatic mentality, it would be a sin. So he explicitly gives us the circumstances in which we would sin when attending an SSPX Mass. But that's it. There are no further qualifications given by Cardinal Hoyos. If Mr. Salza is correct in his assertion that the PCED thinks that we would sin if we would substitute the fulfillment of our Sunday obligation at an SSPX chapel, as well as if we commune there, it would be the most absurd and, in fact, we have to say it, evil thing for Hoyos to not mention these facts. Mr. Mershon and so many other Catholics want to know if they are sinning or not if they frequent SSPX chapels, and Cardinal Hoyos gives us clear directions on when it would be a sin and when not, but then leaves out these major points, basically the most important thing for any Catholic who regularly attends Mass, namely communing and the third commandment, meaning fulfilling your Sunday obligation. This is really unthinkable, and you would have to assume that the PCED or Cardinal Hoyos is either stupid or completely ignorant, or even worse, you would have to assume that he is deliberately withholding this most important information from us, which would make him an evil prelate. So Mr. Salza, without noticing it, actually has to implicitly accuse Cardinal Hoyos of either stupidity, ignorance, or malevolence in order to uphold his argument. This is absurd and would not withstand in any reasonable court. According to Mr. Salza's line of thinking, Cardinal Hoyos must have withheld the fact that you are not sinning unless you're fulfilling your Sunday obligation there and unless you're communing there, which are clearly two of the most important things for any serious Catholic who wants to attend Mass. How is it that Cardinal Hoyos fails to mention this? Is it because he is stupid, ignorant, or evil? Or could it be the case that the PCED and Cardinal Hoyos have a different opinion than that of Mr. Salza, and that Mr. Salza's whole argument could be wrong? This seems much more reasonable to me, and also to so many others. I do not want to have to accuse Cardinal Hoyos of these things. I rather trust that he is benevolent and of good faith. So if we really dissect the answers from Cardinal Hoyos and the PCED, we see that the most plausible, reasonable, and sound understanding is the same that Mr. Mershon himself arrived at. Namely, the understanding that with these answers we can conclude that we can fulfill our Sunday obligation at an SSPX chapel. Mr. Salza chose to ignore this letter in his video because he says it is not talking about Sunday obligation, but only Mass attendance. But what Mr. Salza, in my opinion, completely forgets in his legalistic approach of interpreting this correspondence is the context. A lay Catholic is asking a Catholic prelate whether or not he can frequent SSPX chapels. It would almost be a robotic way of thinking to focus so much on the word attend or frequent, simply because the word fulfill was not used in the question answer explicitly. Even if the word is not used, why would a lay Catholic ask a Catholic prelate this question of Mass attendance if not for the reason of fulfilling one's Sunday obligation and communing? So to conclude, what do we have as statements and documents from the Church or the PCED which deal with Sunday obligation? We actually only have one more or less legit direct statement which supports Salza's claim, namely the one which is found within the article of the French magazine from 2002. Then we have this letter of clarification from 2003, which restates that in the strict sense you can fulfill your Sunday obligation. And then also we have the additional comprehensive document from 2008, which can be used, in my opinion, as strong support of the fact that you can fulfill your Sunday obligation at the SSPX. So after going through all these statements and documents, I think it becomes completely untenable to take the position that the Church is consistent and clear on this point in a negative sense. And it also becomes very hard and possible only with marvelous mental gymnastics to say that you cannot fulfill your Sunday obligation according to the PCED. Rather, when going through these statements within their full context, I think it very well supports the fact that as Catholics, we can attend an SSPX Mass in order to fulfill our Sunday obligation. One last thing that I want to mention here in order to support my claim is Father C's public testimony. a priest who worked with the PCED. He said that the opinion within the PCED was that one can fulfill his Sunday obligation at an SSPX chapel. I really see no reason why we should trust Mr. Salza's opinion more than Father C's testimony. Either Mr. Salza must accuse Father C of lying, or he must take the position that the whole PC doesn't get it and actually has a wrong opinion on this matter. So now we can ask, why is Mr. Salza so sure that you cannot fulfill your Sunday obligation at the SSPX? I mean, we can now see that the documents from the PCED actually do not support this assertion. So why is he so sure about it? It is pretty obvious. It is because he presupposes something. He presupposes that the SSPX is in schism, and even further removed from a church than, say, the Orthodox. And therefore, we cannot fulfill our Sunday obligation, which with these presuppositions obviously becomes a no-brainer. Mr. Salza claims that the SSPX does not celebrate a Catholic rite, which is required by canon law for fulfilling the Sunday obligation, because the SSPX is not within the Roman Church and is also not a church sui juris. Mr. Salza, of course, does not just assert this. He tries to prove it in other videos with the Logos Project and also in his articles. Which leads me to the end of this video, because this question obviously touches the question of whether the SSPX is in schism or not. And I want to dedicate a whole video that will deal with this question. So I hope this video was helpful, and I'm looking forward to a response. Although, unfortunately, I doubt it, since Mr. Salza said to me in our discussion in the comments that he will turn his attention to more worthy opponents. Thank you for watching, and please share all your thoughts, questions, and/or objections in the comment section below. Jesus is King.